Well, hi everyone, Ron Vaillant here. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be talking about a multifaceted hot potato that everyone needs to watch. It doesn't matter which part of Canada you're from. This information is absolutely vital and critical. Whether Alberta separates or not, that's the topic that we're talking about. But primarily we're talking about the various different Indian bands in Alberta and across the nation, actually, who are opposing this whole idea of Alberta separation. And that's what we're going to focus in on. And you're going to hear information here that you'll not hear anywhere else. You know, there's no one else talking about some of these aspects. And it will absolutely affect your life in the future, whether Alberta separates or not. And so the good part about this whole topic is that it's going to raise awareness on some of these different aspects. You won't hear it in the mainstream media per se, but I'll be raising it here, and hopefully if people can get the word out, then people can get educated as to what's really going on. And so what is happening here? You know, you have this talk of Alberta separation, but really the main reason why the uproar is happening in Alberta with the various different Indian bands has to do with a thing called Bill 54, the Elections Statutes Amendments Act, that was brought forward in the Alberta Legislative Assembly. And there's 7 aspects to that. And one of them, which is the most controversial one, I suppose, would be a thing called the Citizen Initiative Act. And in that, what it allows for is for citizens to trigger a referendum on various different topics. And what Danielle Smith and the UCP has done is they've lowered the amount. It was before you could do this act was approximately 600,000 signatures is what you'd have to have in, I believe it is 60 days. You had to collect those signatures for this referendum. And it got lowered to approximately, it's a percentage of how many people voted in the last election and stuff like that, but it would be 177,000 people would have to go and sign for a referendum on Alberta separation, and they extended it from 60 days to 90 days, I believe. Okay, so what people are saying is that Danielle Smith is pro-separation by having lowered this thing, and she's kind of distancing herself from it and everything else. But there's a video actually, and if you guys have a link to this video, I'd like you to post it below. I tried finding it for this video, but I couldn't. And that is Ezra Levant of Rebel had asked her a question in regards to this whole issue of Alberta separation and whatnot. And it was primarily focused on the demands that the UCP and Danielle Smith are making towards Mark Carney, that if they have to be met, to satisfy Alberta. And Ezra says, okay, so Quebec had an or else, you meet our demands or else. What does Alberta have as an or else regarding these demands to Mark Carney and the Liberals? And then she started talking about, before she was elected, how she met with Dennis Moudry of the Alberta Prosperity Project, who, are talking about Alberta separation. And then so she said, this is our or else. And that's very important. So, that, tied in with the fact of lowering the numbers of people who would be needed to have, to trigger a referendum, ties together, I think. And also that you have like the Alberta Prosperity Project, and this is probably 3 weeks to a month old now, that they've collected at least 250,000 people who would vote for Alberta separation referendum question, and it's probably much higher now. So it's a given, though, that Alberta will have a referendum on Alberta separation, and the only thing that I can think that would stop it is a topic that we're going to talk about here today, and that is the various different Indian bands are going to oppose it legally, and all the different facets that go along with all of that. And it's not just a matter of the Alberta government and the various different Indian bands that are involved here. It has to do with the federal government, it has to do with a thing called UNDRIP, it has to do with the United Nations, and it's a really big deal. And I think it all ties in with the World Economic Forum. When they posted the video, it says by 2030 you'll own nothing and be happy. So there's so many different aspects to this thing. It's not, you just can't look at it as just one little thing and say that's what the whole issue is about, because there's all kinds of other things at play. So I'm going to try my best to unpack some of this, and we'll get into it here. So, so at this point of the recording, it hasn't passed. It's called Bill 54, from what I know, and these videos are showing they are forcing an issue with the Alberta government, and then they went ahead and they responded to it by putting an amendment, so-called, in this Bill 54 to respond to these things that we're going to hear about today. But okay, well, let's kind of get into it. We'll just play the first clip, and we'll comment afterwards.
In Manitoba, chiefs have been meeting all week on a number of issues. Among the discussion is supporting the chiefs in Alberta who are speaking out against Premier Danielle Smith, who will be tabling legislation supporting a referendum on the issue. AFN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Niebenak says this isn't the first time a province tried to leave Canada. She referenced when Quebec tried to separate in the 1980s but couldn't, after the late Elijah Harper stood with an eagle feather and said no to the Meech Lake Accord.
If people aren't happy in this beautiful country that we're building together, then you're free to go and live wherever you want, but you can take the dirt that, you know, maybe your ancestors brought with them when they came over here from, you know, other places. That's the only piece of land that you're going to take, but you're not going to take any treaty land, any inherent land from any of our First Nations people across our beautiful country. You know, this isn't a newish issue. Quebec tried to do this way back when. At the same time, you can't do it. There's treaty. All of Canada is treaty territory. It's inherent rights. First Nations were here first. We welcomed people from, you know, to our shores. We welcomed people with open arms. We want to build a beautiful country together. You're welcome here, but at the same time, if you're not happy here, you're free to go.
Okay, so here we have the AFM National Chief Niebenak talking about how if anyone plans to separate, the only thing they're going to take with them is the dirt that they came with when they came onto their land, right? Kind of a derogatory comment, actually, the way that's made. But the other thing is the issue is that you're not going to take any treaty land or inherent land. So that's something that has to be discussed and understood here. And we're going to get into it a little bit later on. But we'll go on to the next clip. So just remember how it's being laid out here.
Good afternoon. My name is Chief Troy Bossman Knowlton. My traditional name is Bearhead. I come to you from the Piikani Nation in southern Alberta and the president of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The alarming statements and actions the province has been taken is being met head to head by the chiefs of Alberta. We've come together to issue a statement and to strategize on how we're going to get the message out to the Premier and to all of Alberta that this is treaty country. And any talk of separation is really insanity, because there is no pathway to separation. You can have all the referendums you want, but there is no way. And for the province to not engage with First Nations, if they're going to make statements like that, really shows the respect that they have for the original inhabitants of this land. So I joined together with my brothers and sisters, the chiefs, Treaties 6, 7, and 8, as well as support from First Nations across Canada who know what we're going through. They know that the battles that we're embarking on. And what has happened today is separation. The rhetoric and insanity of separation here in Alberta has united First Nations on this land, but all across Canada from coast to coast to coast. And if you feel that you have problems with First Nations, you could leave. And ask yourself, how confident would I be for a government that's going to recognize a First Nation and give them what's rightfully theirs, when today we're dealing with this in 2025?
All right, so here we have Troy Bossman, the president of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Blackfoot is primarily southern Alberta, the Cree northern. But here he is talking about, and some key points were brought up here that are very important. You just can't gloss over them, okay? First of all, he says that there is no pathway for Alberta separation on account of them, right? And the issues that he's going to be bringing up. The other point that you brought up is that for the Alberta government to have, had Bill 54 and this whole thing of lessening the possibility of an Alberta referendum on Alberta sovereignty, is that they didn't consult with them, and that has to do with another topic we're going to talk about here right away, and that's a real big issue. That's the biggest story in Canada that no one knows about. He called it insanity, and it's something that you can't possibly do. And then he says, if you don't like it, then you can leave, implying that this is their land, and if you don't like it, then you can leave. And then it goes on, he says that what has to happen is that Alberta needs to give them what's rightfully theirs. So that's another issue. Okay, so let's just kind of do a little bit of quick history here. And that is, okay, you had, these various different Indian bands all across Canada. They say that they were the first here. There's people question that. They say that they came here from probably, Russia, and that they actually wiped out other people who were here before them. But anyhow, that's another issue. But you always hear that they were here from time immemorial. But anyhow, okay, so now you have the Europeans coming over, and you had basically, like, okay, in Alberta as an example, you had the Cree, kind of scrapping with the Blackfoot for hunting territory, south of Edmonton. And I know actually of one person, and on a certain farm, you could actually go with an ice cream bucket, a big one, and you could collect enough arrowheads and tomahawk heads, to fill the whole bucket. And so these various different bands were scrapping amongst themselves, and they're essentially hunter-gatherers, right? And primarily living in the Stone Age, quite frankly. And so anyhow, but they're fighting amongst each other, and then you end up having a bigger tribe coming in from Europe now, and they're moving in, and the technology, even though they were primitive, with their wagons and different things, they actually had technology that is about 4,000 years more advanced than what the native Indians had, because they were, like I said, living in the Stone Age, and these other people were coming in, and they had items made out of metal, and in order to do that, you'd have to mine in the earth, and you'd have to smelter it, and and they were doing manufacturing, and they were bringing in Winchester rifles, and a huge difference, and I'm not trying to disparage, the fact that they were living in the Stone Age, because had I been living with a Cree or the Blackfoot, and I would never have in a million years even thought about the idea of digging in the earth to find iron ore and then melting it and pouring it into molds, and how would you even do it with, you don't even have any kind of molds, or, you can't use a wooden bowl to, pour your molten steel into and whatnot. So, it's just like so far off the charts. In a million years, I would not have even thought of anything like that. And so it has nothing to do with, condescending with an attitude. It's just, I wouldn't have thought of it either. It's just that, these other civilizations were just so much more technically advanced, right? And so you had this group of people coming in, and then what was happening also is that from the States, they were bringing up whiskey, and there was whiskey traders, and it was just absolutely decimating these various different bands. And it got to be so bad that in Canada, in Eastern Canada, they heard about it. So then they developed the RCMP, basically, to come over and try and deal with these traders of whiskey. And from what I understand, that the various different bands, they really appreciated that, because, had they not, dealt with that situation, it just would have absolutely decimated them. And so there was all of this going on, and there was a thing called the Royal Proclamation, and this is actually a very key issue. It's a Royal Proclamation of 1763. And King Charles had made this proclamation. He said anything, west of the Appalachian Mountains, and this is, Canada, U.S., would be treated as an Indian reserve, right? And you're not to go and settle in those areas. And we'll get into that a little bit later on, I suppose, the meaning of that. But Okay, so they were going in, and obviously, they went past that, because that proclamation of 1763 really read like an internal memo, but it's actually being used for land claims all across Canada right now. But obviously they went past that, and they were starting to settle in the West, and so it ended up being that the buffalo herds were diminishing in its potency, and they're worried about starvation actually, and all these different, there's a whole bunch of different factors. So they got together and they said, okay, and this is in the 1800s, 1860s roughly, and there was treaties signed in Alberta. There was other treaties signed before that, east of that Alberta, but there was treaties 6, 7, and 8 that were signed, and each treaty is different with these different bands. And so there's these treaty territory. Remember that they were talking about this as treaty territory. And this is something that you have to absolutely understand with this whole thing, is that the treaty territory is the area in which that particular, type of document was signed with the various different bands. Okay. And the way it was, as far as the land claim goes, is that it was with the Dominion of Canada, in which it was a crown, basically, where these agreements were made between the various bands and Dominion of Canada. Alberta wasn't a province yet, and with that, they were saying, okay, because they were worried about not being able to have any land because all of these settlers were coming in, the Europeans type of thing, right? Another larger band was coming in, so a family of 5, let's say, they would be given a whole section of land, which is 1 mile square. So approximately over like 120 acres per person. And you could have that in a reserve, or you could have it privately. But if you got it into a reserve, then there was all kinds of different perks that you would get as well. You would get money from the government, and then you would also get some cattle as well. Like if you had 4 people, you get 2 cattle, so that you could replace, the buffalo that are, becoming extinct. And there's all kinds of different little aspects to it, but primarily as far as land goes. So what was agreed upon were these reserves. And so that is actually their land as far as the treaty agreements. And anything outside of that was not to be their land. They ceded it, they gave it over, they surrendered it. And another aspect to it was that they could actually go and hunt on lands that were not settled upon, basically. Okay, so there's all of that. But what is being, brought towards the people, and if people don't understand this, is that it's making it look like treaty land, like Treaty 6, 7, and 8. All of that land is their land. That's how they're kind of claiming it. And they actually are claiming it now through a thing called UNDRIP. And I'll be posting links below that you can actually get on par with the subject. But fundamentally, UNDRIP is the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that was 20 years in the making. And there was an Indian chief, Wilton Littlechild of the Mamaway Atascowin over, you heard of Hobima in Alberta, of that band. He was one of the creators of this whole thing. So UNDRIP, is a kind of an Alberta-born somewhat document, but it went through the UN. And this whole issue now with UNDRIP is there's a thing called Bill C-15. I'll just briefly go over it so you can understand it. And that was passed in 2021, around June, July-ish. Right when, there was that whole uproar of the Kamloops Graves story that went all over the news. And I knew about that 20 years prior to that whole story, but it conveniently came up just at the time when this bill was being passed and going to go to the Senate. And what this bill is that all Canadian law has to be consistent with the Declaration, and the Declaration is identified as this thing called UNDRIP. Okay, so it talks about all the rights of these Indigenous people, even though the document doesn't identify who Indigenous is, and that's on purpose. But anyhow, in the bill of C-15, they identify the Indigenous through the 1982 Constitution, and in Section 35.1, it identifies, it doesn't say Indigenous, it says the Aboriginals. The Aboriginals are the Indian, Inuit, and Métis people, okay? Both Aboriginal and Indigenous, to me, are UN globalist terms, and I don't think people of the First Nations, or even the First Nations thing is another thing that is a UN globalist term, quite frankly. Because when I was growing up, it was North American Indian, right? So when you hear me talk and I use the word Indian, it's not a derogatory term. I mean, that's just basically how you identify it. It's just like saying East Indian. It's not derogatory in any way. And those who are Indians themselves prefer to be called Indians than First Nations or Aboriginal or Indigenous, especially Indigenous, right? And for good reason. But the cell on UNDRIP is saying that we have to have this document in order to ensure, these people have their rights. And it's sold like they don't have enough rights. But yet in Canada, anyone who's Indian, Inuit, or Métis, they have more rights than you or I who are not, Indians, right? And so, they get free housing, they get free health care. They get, money bags of money, or, come dropping from the sky, from royalties and different things. Like, they already have far more rights than we do, right? But anyhow, that's another thing. But that's the cell. And then when you go and read it through the document, you say, yeah, of course they have rights to their cultural lands and heritage and practices and all that kind of stuff. But you have to see it through the lens. There's 46 articles of UNDRIP. It's not that thing big of it's only a small little book like this, okay? But it's so open-ended and so convoluted in its implications that it's just a bombshell. But anyhow, in Article 26, it says that the Indigenous, whoever they are, right, have the right to the lands, territories. That's why territories is a very important word when they talk about territories, because they're referencing it back to UNDRIP. So that they have right to the lands, territories, and resources to which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used, right? So, if they've, like with what was mentioned here, when he mentioned their inherent rights, and I guess she mentioned inherent rights, but okay, so they're talking about, they're bypassing the treaties. The treaties were made. Okay, and Treaty 8 goes into the northern part of BC and the rest of BC, southern BC, they didn't have any agreements at all, right? But they're primarily bypassing these treaties that were made, and now they're claiming all the land. This is going on all across Canada right now, and whenever you see something start with a land declaration, like even in Edmonton with the Edmonton Oilers, they say we acknowledge that we're on treaty land, right? These are land claims, and they will be used in court cases in the future. And it all stems back to UNDRIP. And so Article 26 talks about that they have the rights to any land that they've ever used. So that when they talk about their ancestral lands and everything else, within the treaty territory, they're claiming all of it. They're not just talking about the reserves. And Article 28 basically talks about how restitution has to be made about this whole thing. So either the land is given back, like all the land that they're claiming, or restitution be made in some kind of financial payments for the use of the land over all of these years. So all of us who are living on these lands, paying our taxes and everything else, one day in the future, we may be called upon for restitution for having used these lands, right? So that's a whole other thing. But the key aspect of what I'm trying to point out here is that when it comes to treaty lands, it's not the whole entire treaty territory. That's just the area in which these agreements were made with these bands. And it's the reserve land, that 120 acres per person of what they actually agreed upon at that point, okay? So let's continue on here. We'll watch some more confirming, speeches on this whole thing.
Good afternoon. My name is Chief Billy Joe Tucker with the Miksuk Cree First Nation. Yesterday, you made 4 demands to the Prime Minister of Canada. That was a no-no because you gave him a time limit till the 2026 to get their things in order. But you will not do what you want without the approval of the treaty people. You talk about a reset with Canada, you must reset with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Bill 54, this is what we think of you. You're garbage like that. This is treaty land, and we stand on it today. Thank you.
Okay, so here we have some other key statements that we have to look at. And he says, you will not do what you want without the approval of the treaty people. So how is it, okay, so if these treaty agreements were made and they made their various different reserves, now those reserves are essentially like their own little country within a country, right? And why is it that the province would have to have their approval in order to be able to talk about it, Alberta separation? We'll talk about that here right away. He also talked about how it's important that the province reset with the people of Turtle Island. So they're not happy enough with the treaties that they made back then. They want to go and renegotiate this kind of thing. They want to do a reset with all of this. And all of this actually ties into this whole truth and reconciliation that was pushed upon Canada. And you got the document there of murdered and missing Indigenous women report, which basically says it's an imperialistic genocide. And when you tie it all into this whole UN agenda of wanting to set up a world government, and the capitalist West is essentially standing in its way, you can see that all these things kind of tie back together, and they're not in isolation at all. And so now we have to go ahead and have a reset with them. And the issue of Turtle Island. So Turtle Island in their belief system is North America, and it was raised up to save the people, right? And so it's a sacred thing to them. So the Turtle Island is your land that you're sitting on. It's Turtle Island. And if there's any kind of resource development, you start mining into Turtle Island, you're disturbing the nervous system of Turtle Island. And if you put a dam on a river, you're blocking its arteries and its flow of water. And where this is going to go in the future, basically, and it's kind of happening in BC now because BC is the leader in Canada as far as UNDRIP goes. But in BC, as an example, most of the land in BC, private and public, is being handed over to the various different Indian bands to be the stewards of the land. So they're basically going to be calling the shots as to, in order to be able to fight climate change and save the planet and save Turtle Island and all these different things. That, that's in the future thing, but it's definitely, being played up to it. But so Turtle Island is a thing you're going to hear about, and it's a big deal. It's not just some kind of thing off to the side. It's going to be the central core of dramatic decolonization of Canada. Okay. And then he says, this is treaty land and we stand on it today. Now, I don't know where they were standing, if they were on a reserve. If they were on a reserve, well, then they're on treaty land. But if not, then, if they were, let's say, in Edmonton, some other place, they're claiming that as being their treaty land. Again, so they're going well beyond what their treaty agreements were, and now they're claiming all of it, all the area within that thing. It's just, to me, it's a con job, basically. And the other issue here, that when it talks about, okay, we'll go back to, you will not do what you want. So fundamentally, what's being said here is that the governments, whether of anything, municipal or provincial or federal, they cannot do anything unless they get their approval. And that's the way it's going. And how is that possible? It's, again, with UNDRIP, right? And again, you have to look at UNDRIP through the lens of Article 26, where basically they can claim all the land. And if they can claim all the land, all these different aspects of part of UNDRIP basically fall in, to their land, which is all of it that they're claiming. And so Article 32 is an important one. And this is basically where Andrew Scheer, when he was asked in the 2019 federal election about UNDRIP, he made it look like the Conservatives were against UNDRIP because he says, oh, well, we got to figure out what this really means in order to go ahead. But he didn't talk about the really big issues with UNDRIP. So here's Article 32, 2.2. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain the free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories or other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploration of mineral water or other resources. So it's called the free, prior, and informed consent. And Andrew Scheer was saying, well, we got to figure out what this free, prior, and informed consent is. Well, a child can understand what that is, you have it so that they understand what the terms are and that you have their consent before you do anything, right? It's anyhow, to me, that was just kind of like a political theater, but that's where we're at now. Because Bill C-15 has passed, it is law, and they do have an UNDRIP strategy plan that is going into place, in which, by the way, I'll have videos linked below that you can watch to get into play. David Lamenti, when he was the Liberal Justice Minister, he went on, and I got a 1-minute video on there, and he says that we went ahead and we negotiated with the various different bands in Canada, and that we come up with this new UNDRIP strategy plan. And then he goes on to say that undoing 150 years of colonialism is more than the mandate of one government. So when you think about that, colonialism, what is colonialism? Well, colonialism can be tied to everything: the roads, the whole structure of society, the technology and advancements, that they brought with them. Everything is colonial, right? And so why would you want to undo all of that? And this is the big thing that is a part of UNDRIP is, to decolonize. And it doesn't make any sense because our entire society is built upon it. We have all kinds of, advancements that make life a lot better than if we were living as hunter-gatherers, 400 years ago with no, technology or advancements this way. But it all has to do with UN Agenda 21, which Brian Mulroney and the Conservatives signed Canada onto in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro summit. And it's also having to do with UN Agenda 2030 that Stephen Harper and Pierre was there, and the Conservatives, they signed on to UN Agenda 2030. And that is to deindustrialize the world. And so it's going to be under the pretext of decolonization. And what the various different Indian bands need to realize is that they're being set up as, kind of like the scapegoats to go ahead and to push this thing forward. And it's going to be so egregious that people are going to rise up against it. And if they rise up against it, they're going to rise up against these various different Indian bands, and it can cascade into a whole bunch of other things. And since the declaration is made that it's an imperialistic genocide on these people, you use the word genocide, that invokes the UN. The UN can come into countries and say, well, we have a genocide going on here and we're going to have our way, right? And so it's just so deep, all of this. But anyhow, so in BC, as an example of what's going on, I know people, they have their property, 80 acres, and leading to their property, getting into their property, is an 80-foot private bridge that was built by the previous owner. Now just think about what it would take to build an 80-foot bridge over a river. It costs, probably $500,000, $1 million nowadays to do that. And so it's a tremendous, feat for an individual to go ahead and make this bridge over this water. And so it's on Crown land because, on either side of rivers are Crown land. And so they have to renegotiate the lease. It's a 10-year lease. So back in 2022, the lease came up, and so they went to go renegotiate, and these new onerous terms are put on it. They had to go and get public liability insurance in case someone jumps off the bridge and kills himself or whatever. And they also had to put up $100,000 for the decommissioning of the bridge in the future if it needed to be, right? And so they were willing to pay the $100,000 so they can keep their bridge and keep, access to their property. But then the bureaucrat who probably hasn't even built a paper plane in his life, goes and tells him, and he's just going along to get along, he's being paid by the government to go and do all this stuff, said to them that basically we cannot go ahead and give you a 10-year agreement. We can only go to 2030, because by 2030, the province is going to officially give back the Crown land to the Indians in pristine condition, or decolonized is another word of saying it. So by 2030, the bridge is coming down anyhow. So they decided not to go ahead with it and lose $100,000, just for 8 years of access and the bureaucrat and the government of BC, they went and they tore down that bridge. Can you imagine? They tore it down, and the excuse is saying that they want to give it in pristine condition. What Indian driving his colonized, Ford F-150, driving up to that bridge, will not just love to be able to spend 10 seconds of driving over that bridge that they never had to conceptualize, or fabricate or pay for in the first place. They just they can just drive over it, and then they can go hunting on the other side, right? But now, because they're supposed to be given to them, on this pretext of being pristine condition land, they're going to pull up with their colonized vehicle there, and they're going to have to get out of it, and they're going to have to forge across the stream, and they will probably have to leave their high-powered rifles behind too, because that's colonization as well. And then they can go hunting with bow and arrows across. You know what I mean? Like, it's just crazy, right? So it's a pretext. All of this whole thing with UNDRIP and land claims and everything else, and saving Turtle Island and all this stuff. It ties back to the UN and to the point of where you're going to own nothing and be happy, because if all the land is claimed by these various different Indian bands and you are now renters on the land, you have to go along with whatever agenda is being, told them to do to bring upon us. And if you don't go along with that, then, like they say, you can leave. This is our territory, you can leave. And this issue of that you can leave and it's our territory was demonstrated with Tanya Gaw of Action for Canada. I suggest you go and check her out, and her work that she's doing is, incredible. But anyhow, she had learned about UNDRIP, and she went and she was going to do a seminar in Port Alberni in Vancouver Island. And Ken Watts, the Indian chief there, said that you're not allowed, on our territory. You're not welcome here. And pressure was put on the venue, and the venue people relented, and they, shut it down. And so she had to go and find another venue, someone willing to go ahead and do this. And this is where it's going, right? So it's all this elaborate scheme that's been in decades in development. But anyhow, so this free, prior, and informed consent. So everything is going to have to be approved. And the way it's going to work, it's not going to be the government's, calling the shots. Everything is going to be co-governed. It's going to be a 50-50 split. And Pierre Poilievre, when he was talking about the 50-50 split, he was talking about it also financially. So the financial issue is going to be split 50-50, right? So I got a video down below. You can watch it. Well, what Pierre doesn't tell you is that those three various bands, they've claimed all of Vancouver, and they're using this royal proclamation of 1763. And the city council has said that these three bands are the rightful title holders of the land. And they come up with this whole UNDRIP strategy plan, which you can watch the video down below. Okay, so, all right, so let's continue on, I suppose, and we'll see a few more here. I know this is getting long, but please, it's well worth you understanding all of this, all right?
Good afternoon. My name is Wilfred Hokanuza. I'm a chief of Denada First Nation and also a Grand Chief of North Peace Tribal Council. There is developments that are happening in our traditional territory. The ongoing clearing of trees, farmland, and that's impacting our way of life. Section 35, our hunting, fishing, and trapping rights. And we will say no to further dictatorship from foreign governments. Our treaty was here before the province became a province in 1905, and we're not going anywhere. And I just want to bring home a clear message to the government that the Crown has a responsibility. This is federal government to ensure that our obligations are met. Thank you.
Well, okay, all right. So here we go. First mention is traditional territories. Again, this is another way of bypassing the treaties and the land agreements that were made, because they say this is our traditional territories, and because of Bill C-15 and Article 26 of UNDRIP, they're claiming all of it. It's something that they've used previously, right? And they have the right to it now. And the other issue, again, is going into how forestry, the forest industry, and how farming, to feed everyone, is impacting their rights, their treaty rights. Talking about, he refers to the Constitution 35. And again, that's kind of a bit of a smokescreen too. But before I get into that, is this issue that this whole UNDRIP thing is going to be used to shut down, to decolonize Canada, and to make it so that the forestry is not going to be happening, to shut down the farms. Now, the farmers are basically very independent people, and the reason why they're willing to live off in the Tules there is so that they can have free autonomy. And this flies in the face of a UN agenda to be able to control the world with their world parliamentary system. And so self-independence has to be taken down. And this is why they're going after farming. They're going to be going after, having your own well, having your own garden, these kind of things. And so they're going to be using these people to go ahead and to talk about this issue and to shut it down. And so forestry and farming is impacting their way of life. Now, when the treaties were made, they were said that they can continue on hunting and fishing on non land that has been already settled, type of thing, right? But now they're going way beyond that, and they're saying that someone who has a farm is impacting our ability to go and hunt and fish. So the farm's got to go. And starvation will come, I guess, is the thing that's going to happen after that. But no to foreign governments, so because they're claiming all the land, this is their land, they were here first, and UNDRIP gives them that ability to claim it all. Any other government that is piled on top of that is a foreign government, Alberta government or federal government, whatever. And I think this is the reason why they're really getting upset with this whole issue of Alberta separation, because the bar has been lowered so that there absolutely will be a referendum on Alberta separation. They're trying to fight back, and they're going to fight back in the court system, I think, using 32.2 of UNDRIP, where it says you have to have free, prior, and informed consent, to do anything. So before you can have a referendum on sovereignty, is you have to get their approval, right? So I think that's where it's, if anything is going to shut down a referendum on Alberta sovereignty, it's going to be 32.2 of UNDRIP, okay? But he talks about the federal obligations need to be met. And so the federal obligations was like a never-ending, continual giving of money to the various different bands, and free housing, free education, and all these things. It's been an absolute windfall for them, really, over the decades. And in the 2019 federal election, I did a rough estimate from the 1950s till then was adjusted for inflation that, like $4 trillion was spent on Indigenous or Indian issues, right? And what's to show for all of that, right? And so if you go ahead and you have an Alberta separation, and the agreement was made with the different various Indian bands with the Dominion of Canada, if Alberta was to separate and become its own country, then those agreements are essentially null and void. Now it's like an agreement made with one corporation, and then the corporation ceases to exist, that all those agreements with that corporation would cease to exist as well. And I think that's what they're really worried about here, because if Alberta separates, then everything's up for grabs. And now Danielle Smith has said that they would go ahead and they would just go ahead and, administer or have all of those treaties as they were, basically, I think that's the wrong approach, because those agreements, like with the land agreements, personally, I think that's fine. I mean, obviously those agreements are made and that's no problem. But this perpetual non-ending giving of taxpayers' money to them is not helping them at all. It just creates a welfare state, and it doesn't help them to be the people that they need to be, and develop. And it's not fair to the taxpayers as well. I mean, so if Alberta was to separate, all those treaties, need to be renegotiated. And I think that the handing out of money continually needs to stop, and have an 8-year plan where you dwindle it down, and go from there. The land is fine. The treaty land that they've agreed upon, the reserves and everything else, that's fine. Privatize it. Don't have the government involved in it anymore. They can develop it how they want. It'd be a good idea to divvy it up in 1 or 2 acre parcels so that other peoples can live on that land, and go from there, and then move on. I mean, you can't go back, like with what UNDRIP is trying to do and everything else. You're going back 300 years, and all of the trillions and quadrillions of dollars, I guess, of money invested and infrastructure built, over hundreds of years. You just can't go and say, well, hey, that's not yours anymore. It's going to cause civil war when people really realize what's going on with this whole thing. And maybe civil war is where they want it to go, so the UN can come in with their blue hats and have their way, and amalgamate it into the UN parliamentary system that they have, right? But also, I guess the way I see things going is that it seems, and I've mentioned this in other videos, that we're all being kind of cattle shooted into this Alberta separation. And I'm leery of the people who are leading it. You got Danielle Smith and the UCP. They're pro-UNDRIP. And there's a video that you can see down below. It's in this section with Danielle Smith. And she's basically trying to sell the idea that we're going to get a corridor, an energy corridor, going across, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and going to, she says Churchill, but Churchill is definitely in the plans for a big port there, and is all kinds of things involved with that. But the sell is that we're going to get Alberta oil to Tidewater through Churchill, because the federal government has put a tanker ban on the West Coast with Bill 48. But the thing is that you can go ahead and make all your agreements and make this thing happen, but all the federal government just has to say is that we're going to put a tanker ban in the Hudson's Bay as well. So it's ridiculous. But the sell is to get the oil to Tidewater, but the kill, what I call it, is to have UNDRIP enacted, through all these different provinces, because she says if the federal government objects, we'll just use the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples to get it to Tidewater, because they have their rights, right? And people just don't know what's going on, and they cheer on this whole thing of this energy corridor thing, right? But so the UCP is definitely, full on. I see them as UN globalists with what they're doing, and so that's not good. And then you got the APP with Dennis Moudry and Jeff Rath. Jeff Rath is Indigenous lawyer for 25 years. I mean, he's definitely worked with them intimately, and so he's definitely going to be biased in their favor. And what the APP is, saying now is that we have to have their approval in order to go ahead with an Alberta separation. And prior to that, basically, they had a proposed Alberta Constitution for a new Alberta once it separates, and they wanted to enshrine UNDRIP into the Alberta Constitution. And that's just not an oopsie. That's an absolute, deliberate thing that was done there. And I called it out, and now they've backtracked on that and saying, no, we wouldn't have that a part of that. But had I not done that, I'm sure it would still be there. And so you have to look at the APP and see where they're going with this whole thing with the Indigenous issues. So the only way that Alberta can stop UNDRIP and the loss of our land rights in Alberta, so that we will no longer own our own land, is to be able to kill UNDRIP. And the only way you can kill UNDRIP is if you were to have, the government back down on it, and that these treaties be renegotiated or readopted to a new Alberta, give them the land, but all these other things need to stop, and go from there, type of thing. And so that can be done. I mean, it's a long shot, but I don't think it's going to happen personally. But that, I'm just laying out the case that that's the only way that we can stop UNDRIP in Alberta, for Alberta separation, and for the government to denounce it and to have nothing to do with it. And then for an Alberta referendum, really outside of UNDRIP, let's say, and what's going to be dictated to us through the courts on that. Any person of an Indian band would have one vote on the referendum, just like you and I, right? No special privileges have to be given to them. They've already made their treaty agreements for their land and everything else. And so that can be respected. But you don't have to have them co-govern Alberta. You don't have to set up a situation like UNDRIP where basically they are owners of the land. All right, I guess there's more to this. There is actually. There's another clip, I suppose. And we can go look at that. I'm at the end of what I can say at this section, I suppose.
We are uncertain of Alberta's path, and we as treaty people were obligated by the Crown, and we are Canadians. And we're standing up for Canadians to honor the Crown. And that we can't allow the resources to continue to be developed through exploration. Those all have to stop because Alberta wants to separate and are no longer want to be part of Canada. So we as First Nations people are saying that if Alberta wants to separate and doesn't want to be part of Canada, then you're not allowed on our traditional territories anymore for exploration because we don't know who you're explorating for.
A rallying cry from First Nations chiefs as they fight Alberta separation. Hundreds coming together at the steps of the legislature Thursday afternoon to deliver a united no.
I want to respectfully remind the Premier that this land that we stand on today is treaty land and is not yours to take or make sweeping decisions about. This is a violation of our treaty, a threat to peace and friendship we agreed upon.
Earlier in the day, the Onion Lake Cree Nation told the world they are taking it to the courts.
This is based on precedent. This is based on the constitutional section that we do have those Aboriginal rights, and they precede the Constitution.
That she has to repeal that bill.
To quote a line from the treaty's chiefs are resolute. They will oppose separation as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow.
Alberta or any other province out there can't separate from Canada. It's Indigenous land. It's our land. It's unconstitutional.
Before we discuss this clip that we just watched, I'd like to maybe backtrack to the previous clip where it was discussed that forestry and farming impacts our traditional way of life of hunter-gathering, being able to go and hunt off the land. That was demonstrated actually back in the 2019 federal election that I ran in with the northeastern BC. We had gone to a coal and energy forum, and this was over in Tumbler Ridge, and this is around August, and it's this issue called Caribou recovery. And it was a 3-day event, I believe it was, and so we went there and whatnot, and they were talking about UNDRIP, and they'd left it to the very end of the whole 3 days. So I'll just quickly go over that story. I went there with my campaign manager, and in the beginning night, they did a UN movie because in Tumbler Ridge, they've signed on to it being a UNESCO World Heritage Site where, I think it's 1,000 kilometers of area is kind of got the UN's got their hands on it now, and they're all in favor of it, it seems like. So we were watching this movie, and it seemed like the UN, it made it seem like they made the trees, the streams, the birds, the bees, and the mountains, And it took everything for my campaign manager not to get up and grab the mic and talk about, the history of all the hard work of the people in the area who, put Tumbler Ridge on the map as a destination, and everything else like that. So that was that. And then for supper, they did a prayer, and they had an Indian fellow from some band or whatever do the prayer. And I thought, okay, all right. And they also did a land acknowledgement too. And I never heard that before. That was new to me. And so they did a prayer for the food, but, it was, with their bent on it, type of thing. And that's okay. But it happened the next day as well, land acknowledgement as well. And it was Laurie Ackerman, who at that time was the mayor of Fort St. John. So she's acknowledging that they're on Indian land over there. And then they had the prayer for the meal. And I thought, well, maybe they'll have, maybe a Christian guy go up and talk, but no, again, it was another Indigenous guy that they had in there. And, I thought, there's definitely a slant or a bias here, land acknowledgements and having them pray and whatnot. But anyhow, as we went to the very end, and we had the very front row seat and or table, I guess, and I was there videoing it, and we had asked for permission to be able to video the event, and I videoed some sections of it, but I really wanted to cover UNDRIP, or Caribou Recovery, sorry. Because Caribou Recovery, what was the story behind that is that there's an agreement made with the different Indian bands, the BC and the federal government, to be able to set aside, it was like proposed 1 to 3 million acres of land to protect the caribou in BC. Now, I found out that this is going all across Canada, and it's the same story all across Canada. And there was another PPC candidate in Quebec who I talked to who said that that's going on up there and thousands of jobs would be lost on account of this, setting aside all this land for these caribou. So that in BC, it was like April of that year, and they were going through the towns who would be affected, and the entire town would show up because, it might end up impacting that they couldn't forestry development or oil and gas and all these kind of things, and they might lose their jobs and their houses and their family's livelihood up there, right? So, but no word was spoken about UNDRIP, or Caribou Recovery after that, until this event, which is kind of a private event. And so I'm filming there, and then Laurie Ackerman gets up and she says, "I just want everyone to know there's hundreds of people there, that who is it? Ron Vaillant from the PPC." She's looking at me. Is here and he's filming, so I just want everyone to know that. And I yelled out, or said loudly, "Well, I did ask for permission." And she says, "Well, no one told me." She was pretty upset about it, and I was going to release a video on that, but campaign manager said, "You better not, I better get approval from these people before we do that because we might get sued." And everyone unanimously said, "No, you're not going to release a video that I took of that Caribou Recovery." And the one person who gave us a permission, who's a mayor, begged us not to release that video footage, begged us, And so anyhow, I didn't release the footage. The takeaway is that there's things going on behind the scenes that the average person doesn't know about, and no one would know about this unless someone like me said that this is going on. In the Caribou Recovery talk, there was a chief, and I don't remember his name, and I can't backtrack and get it or anything, but he was talking about a BC court case in which, the land can be given to the Indians. And then he made it sound like, that this is going to affect all of Canada. And I says, "Are you talking about claiming the land in BC or all of Canada?" And he said, "All of Canada," right? So there you go. So there's, behind the scenes, these groups are working towards claiming all of Canada's land, and no one has a clue about it. This is back in 2019. And since then, basically, like in BC, the BC government adopted UNDRIP, and they basically, a year or two ago, they gave I think it's the Haida Islands off the west coast. They just, without a court case or any fighting, they just unilaterally just give them those islands, and now the people who are, non-Indian who are living on those islands are under a new governance system, and they're trying to figure out what in the world's going on. And that's where this is all going. And we're at the early stages of it, but it's getting heavily entrenched actually at this point in time. But okay, so back to this video here. So he says that we want to respectfully remind, the Premier that this is treaty land that we're on, and it's not yours to take or to make decisions about. Again, they're bypassing the agreements of the land that they agreed upon, and they're claiming all of that treaty territory. And they're reminding them, saying that, hey, this is our land. We're reminding you of that now, right? And you just can't go ahead and make decisions without our approval. Okay, and then he goes on to say that this thing of what Smith has done with Bill 54 is a violation of our treaty. Now, I don't think it's a violation of their treaty at all. I think this is just smoke and mirrors because the agreements were made with the Dominion of Canada. And if Alberta decides to separate from that, I don't see it's a violation of that treaty at all. But anyhow. Okay, and then he says it's a threat to peace and friendship. So what kind of a peace are they talking about? Will they actually become violent if this goes through? That's the point I'm trying to make here. So he kind of alludes to that. Okay, so then it's talked about how the courts are, that they've done all kinds of work in the courts, and there's precedences made, and there's a constitution that protects their rights and everything else like that. Now, I think the way it's going to be as far as the Constitution protecting them, I think they're going to go right to the issue of this proclamation of 1763, which really is like an internal memo. If anything west of the Appalachian Mountains was to be an Indian reserve, that clearly got discarded somewhere along the line afterwards, because here we are with everyone here, right? So, but they go back to that and they try and make that claim that this is their land on account of this 1763 proclamation. And the way I got onto the 1763 thing is when I did the video talking about how the three Indian bands have claimed all of Vancouver, and that the Vancouver City Council acknowledges them as the rights and title holders, and that the Vancouver has a strategy plan to go along with all of this. In that document, I'm trying to figure out I said, first of all, so what if the City Council says that they're the rights and title holders of the land? That has no bearing on anything. They're just City Council. But it goes further than that, because there was a court case with another band having to deal with this whole thing, I believe, with the 1763, and they won that case. And I think this is where the City Council, sees it's a court precedence, and that they actually would have that courts behind them to make these land claims. And then on page, 23 of that document, it says this, and we can look at it here and read through it. It says the Indigenous peoples hold title to their lands and inherent rights as sovereign peoples of their lands. So they're sovereign from, the governments, right? With their own distinct governance laws, traditions, and cultures. While Indigenous title was recognized with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So they're going back and they're saying that this is their title. 1763 proclamation is their title, saying it's an Indian reservation, which, like I said, obviously got surpassed. Anyhow, so that's what they're claiming. And I thought, what's this Royal Proclamation of 1763? So I started investigating that, and that's where I saw, what I've explained about this thing, about, King Charles and his proclamation. Okay, so reading on, it says, and Aboriginal rights are enshrined in the Constitution, on account of this. And Indigenous peoples have their rights and titles ignored and infringed with consistent efforts at extinguishment by colonial governments. So again, this whole issue of colonialism has to go. Okay, so UNDRIP is mentioned here, finally, offers a framework to protect and uphold Indigenous rights and titles. So this is what's at play behind the scenes, people. And it's shaping new ways. Well, it's new, all right, for the city of Vancouver to work with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh as unique rights and title holders. Oh, the people of Vancouver, do you understand what's going on? Understanding and supporting the distinct rights of peoples within the diverse Indigenous populations living in the city will flow from these relationships and the original laws and governance traditions of these lands. So everything's going to change on account of it. So when I was reading this, it says that their rights are infringed, and their rights are protected by the Constitution. So you go to the Constitution and you say, what are their rights? And you go to 35. It identifies who the Aboriginals are at first, right? So the Aboriginals are the Indian, Inuit, and Métis people. And Bill C-15 points to this section of that Constitution. But anyhow, 35.1 continuing on says the Government of Canada and the provincial governments are committed to the principle that before any amendment is made to Class 24 of Section 91 of the Constitution Act of 1867, and go, oh, brother, like this wild goose chase, trying to figure out what this is, to Section 25 of this Act or in this part. So it goes on talking about all this stuff, right? So it mentions Section 25 of this Act. So, okay, well, what's Section 25 of this Act? What is that talking about? So let's go look at Section 25. Section 25 says the guarantee in this charter of certain rights and freedoms shall not be construed so as to abrogate or degrade from any Aboriginal treaty or other rights or freedoms that pertain to the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including, and this is the bombshell, any rights or freedoms that have been recognized by the Royal Proclamation of October 7, 1763. What? What is that doing in the Constitution of Canada, oh man. So then someone had asked Brian Peckford, who is the last surviving creator and signatory of this document, the 1982 Constitution of Canada, and was asked, why is that in there? Why is the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in this thing? And he didn't know why. So why wouldn't he know why? And I get how you're dealing with all kinds of things and these details could get lost and it could fly over people's heads. And they'll fly over people's heads today when people talk about it because they don't know what it means. But this was, this is Pierre Trudeau, right? Pierre Trudeau, is the one who was the start of this whole thing of reopening up the Constitution and having this thing develop and you look at his history and who he was educated by and whatnot. And anyhow, so this was inserted in there. And, you have to ask a question, here it is being the very basis of land claims all across Canada. Was this, a play developed way back when, 40 years ago to bring us to this point now where we're about to lose our land rights? Is that even a possibility? It's definitely in there, and so that's a really big issue that needs to be talked about. And I think when he's talking about the court cases that are going to be developed, I think it's going to go right back to this thing. So, okay, and I added a second clip just to kind of fast track everything. And so the second clip, he says that you can't separate; it's unconstitutional. So again, it's going back to this whole thing, I think, of 1763. And then he says, this is Indigenous land, it's our land, and it's all of Canada. It's not just Alberta land that they're talking about here. And all of this is being played upon or claimed through UNDRIP. All right, so there you go. I mean, I think I'm kind of beating a dead horse at this point in time, but these are the things that are absolutely vital. And what's the point of Alberta separation if we end up in a situation where the land that we have paid for and we live on is now usurped from beneath us, and we are now renters on the land of this new constitutional Alberta, So things to think about and watch, definitely. And as far as voting separation, you have to watch the players who are involved. And I don't know. I think we're cattle shooted into this thing, and the natural reaction would be, yeah, we have to separate just for our very survival. We're kind of forced in this situation, because of what the federal government's going to do. They're absolutely going to kill Alberta, And so everyone's put into a place who knows what's going on. They know that they have to vote for separation just to even survive. And so where is that going to lead us? And if, a vote is actually passed that we want to separate, I think the Canadian dollar immediately is going to tank. The value of it's just going to go down, and it's going to make it so that, Trump says he wants to annex Canada economically through economic pressure. And if our dollar goes down to 30 cents on the dollar or some crazy thing like that, I can imagine that everyone's going to be, in a world of hurt, and they can say, U.S. can say, well, hey, just come and join with us. We'll give you your peso dollar, for an American dollar. Oh, I don't know. It's just all kinds of crazy stuff. So here we are. We're in wild times now, and we're just going to have to ride through it. So I thought I'd make the video to help educate people as to some of the issues involved, and so we don't go into this blind. All right. Well, thanks for your time, and I appreciate you watching. Bye.